Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for another hour of podcasting greatness on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and everywhere else that good podcasts are sold, as well as with video here on YouTube. Hey everybody, this week I am welcoming back Dr. Jonas Kaplan. He is a cognitive neuroscientist who works out of Los Angeles. Hi Jonas, welcome to the show.
Hey Chris, good to be back.
Yes, very glad to have you back. It has been too long, I think. I have so enjoyed our conversations, and we started out pretty simply trying to break down what the brain is, what it's doing, how it works. Simple questions that don't plague too many people these days, and. And of course, this has all been, for me, a quest of understanding people, understanding thought, understanding belief, and understanding why it is or how it is that people can enter into extremist headspaces or high control groups or give over really too much of themselves to things. And that's where my interest lies. But then it became, in the course of studying psychology and sociology and how and why people and groups operate, that led to the brain, because of course it would. How it's the third leg of trying to understand this thing of behavior, human behavior. Why do we do what we do? Why do we act the way we do? And you have been an enormous help to me, and I think my viewers, in breaking down and trying to figure out how some of this stuff works. So today, I thought we might take a little flight of fancy, a little bit of an approach into the future, because this guy, Elon Musk, keeps throwing into the public conversation, and good for him for doing it, that there is this inevitable, it seems almost destined, that there will be this hybrid or cyborg or bionic connection between people and machines. As a neuroscientist, I guess my first question for you is just in a general sense, what's your attitude, or what do your colleagues, if it's ever come up, do you guys talk about this stuff? And if so, is it science fiction for you guys, or is there some science fact now?
So if the question is, are we all going to be transhumanist cyborgs one day?
Right.
I say yes. I think we probably are. Does it come up in our conversations in neuroscience? Well, there are fields of neuroscience that work directly on brain-computer interfaces. It's not really my field. So for me and for my close colleagues, it is really more of a task of imagination and a fun experiment in science fiction. But with a lot of things in neuroscience, I've seen concepts that I thought were distant science fictions become reality. I mean, we can do things like brain reading with fMRI right now that are pretty advanced and pretty amazing. And so I really try not to count anything out. And I realize that I don't think we're on the verge of any massive technology that changes our relationship with machines. But if I think out into the way, way distant future, I think it probably is inevitable in some degree.
I think I look at it that same way. I do think eventually we're seeing the future. If our planet survives, if our climate survives, if all of that happens too. But barring any other existential crisis, this itself seems to be being pushed forward as a solution to a potential existential crisis of our own making, which is called AI, artificial intelligence, right? And this gets more closely, I think, to your field, because you're a cognitive neuroscientist. You study how we think.
Right.
How, if you were gonna, and I've never asked you this the whole time we've been talking, but if you were going to rate, maybe, I don't know, on a scale of 0 to 1 to 10 or something, in terms of this realization of a vision where we know how we think, to the point that we could get in there and start manipulating thought, recording it, influencing it mechanically. Where would you say we are, even in our understanding of being able to accomplish such a feat at this point?
I think we're chipping away at it. I mean, I think eventually we will understand it. I don't think there's any real reason why we couldn't. It's just a matter of time and reverse engineering and a lot of effort put into understanding something. I mean, with respect to our eventual relationship with machines, I think it's also important to point out that we already have this relationship, right? We
Mhm.
already have a very close interaction between our minds and machines. We have already offloaded a lot of our cognitive processes onto machines. You know, we have a simple example is calculation. I do almost no calculation anymore because I can do it on my computer that I have attached to me, not via direct wires into my brain, but via the manipulation of my fingers and feedback through my eyes. And so we have these close relationships with machines right now that we're constantly touching them. I mean, I'm touching my computer basically all day long. I'm in physical contact with it, right? So the change from having this external relationship with machines to having a direct connection, I think is not as big of a change as we sometimes imagine. I think it's an incremental change for us, really.
I think you're right. I think you're right. In fact, Musk himself on Rogan pointed out how we are almost already hybrids. And I'll push back a little bit on that, but I get his point, because we walk around with our phones, and our phones have become external memory for our brains to the point now with our lives where when I grew up, probably when you did, we memorized phone numbers on rotary dial phones, and then on touch tone. But now I couldn't tell you my wife's phone number, and that's
Yeah,
and it's not even a thing of I feel ashamed of that because it's so much now our reality that it's that we're so technologically independent or
I think
dependent.
through what the costs and benefits of that are, right? I mean, maybe Elon is focused a lot on the benefits, but probably important to also consider the costs. That the fact that we're offloading this memory process onto a machine means that we're not practicing memorizing things in the same way, and we might not be as good at it for when we do need it. Um, Same thing is true for math. I mean, it's definitely harder for me to do simple arithmetic than it was for me when I was in seventh grade, say, for example. So there's definitely some costs, and it's definitely worth considering what those costs are whenever we're going to implement a technology like this.
That's very true. And we find some, again, to just get, the conjecture of it all, we find some science fiction stories and future realities presented to us where we've done this work, made these strides, and then realized we messed up. We went too far. We gave too much. We were too reliant. And I think we see this like in Battlestar, in the latest version of Battlestar Galactica, where they didn't have the machines doing stuff too much. In fact, they were fighting the Cylons. And there's a Dune, also in Dune. This was a theme that you couldn't have any thinking machines. The entire galaxy sort of teamed up and decided this was a good idea because it had been so badly, in some distant past, had been so messed up. So one wonders if that is in our future, if we are racing to this point where maybe we haven't really thought the thought through well enough. And that's what plagues me at night. I look at how social media has developed and how we are now becoming aware of the real dangers and threats to our ability to get along with each other. Completely unintended consequence.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely positive Zuckerberg, Jack, these guys were not plotting to divide America or the world really in the way that it has been because of that technology. Do you think right now? I think the thing that I am most concerned about with this, and I wanted to talk to you about, is how, if we don't understand how we think yet, to the degree that we maybe should, or how we come to decisions, conclusions, how prejudice happens, how bias happens at a mechanical level, then how could we possibly imagine we could control this into the future, right? In terms of merging this with a machine and then basically superpowering it.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I think that's where it is important to talk a little bit about what actually is possible right now and what isn't possible. And I think you're right. There are some brain systems that we don't understand that well, or that are more complicated than others. But there are some brain systems we do understand well enough to be able to interact with them. And I guess the general way that I would split that up is that motor and sensory systems in the brain are fairly straightforward in the sense that they have very regular maps in the cerebral cortex. So one of the first people to physically do this kind of brain mapping in the human brain was Wilder Penfield and his colleagues at the Montreal Neurological Institute in the 40s and 50s. And they would do this in neurosurgery. So instead of implanting something like Elon Musk is going to do, you'd have the person's scalp open during a neurosurgery, and you could deliver little bits of current to different locations in the brain and just see what happened. You'd sort of zap them in one place and the finger would move, and you zap in another place and maybe their shoulder moves. And by doing that, he was able to map out, for example, the motor cortex of the brain, where there's a very regular map of the muscles in the human body, where if you stimulate those, you're going to produce a little muscle movement.
And is that, and I'm sorry, let me interrupt you because I'm always thinking about this. Is that universal? Do we find one for one, you open up somebody's scalp, you hit these spots, and that's what happens?
More or less. I've done some research on that myself in terms of the sensory cortex. So right behind the primary motor cortex is the primary sensory cortex, where you have these maps of the human body in terms of their sensory input. So if you stimulate there, the person's going to feel a little tingle in somewhere in the body. We did a study with functional brain imaging looking at if we train a computer algorithm to learn something about how my brain responds to touch. Actually, we use the observation of touch, but this is a very similar thing. Can it then predict what's happening in your brain based on touch? And we found enough regularity in the cerebral cortex maps that we could tell from one person's brain what was happening in another. It's not an exact correspondence, but the general layout of the body parts is the same, just like the general layout of faces is the same. You have two eyes above a nose. Everyone's face is a little bit different, and everyone's post-central gyrus is a little bit different. It has little different curves and angles to it, but the general layout is pretty similar. And certainly everybody has their primary sensory cortex on that particular gyrus. Gyrus is one of the hills in the cerebral cortex.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah, and the cerebral cortex is the very surface layer of the brain. It's a thin layer of nerve cells that is where our highest cognitive functions are. It's only a few millimeters thick, and very fortunately for people trying to interact with it, it's on the surface of the brain. And that's why these devices that are implanted into the skull are able to reach out these little electrodes, these little hair-like wires to interact with the cerebral cortex. So if you're trying to read off the motor cortex, like in the Neuralink demonstration that they did recently, they had one of these implanted in the motor cortex or actually I think it was in the sensory cortex of the pig, and every time the pig's nose was touched, you could see the action potentials firing there. So these motor and sensory things are fairly easy to read. If you're going to do something like reading off the motor cortex in order to control a prosthetic limb, that's something that's been done in a laboratory, for example. So I think motor functions and sensory functions are kind of a low-hanging fruit here when it comes to brain-computer interfaces. But when you get into more complicated things like memory and more complicated perceptions and thoughts and decision making, it's much more complicated, and it's going to be much more difficult to build those interfaces.
Exactly. I think we're dealing with the difference between, again, low-hanging fruit. This was the first layer of discovery. This was the first order of where we could go to, that we could get physical universe direct confirmation that this point controls the index finger, right index finger, right? It was like, it's unvariable. There it is. We hit this thing, that finger moves 100% of the time, and you go, good, there it is. When you get into, but you get into more complex systems. And I think that's what we're really dealing with, is the complexity of the systems. I was listening to, there's a guy who loves going on Rogan, Lex Friedman, and he talks about mathematical systems, computer guy and science guy, and he talks about the fact that we don't yet have a math that really takes into account the level of complexity of the systems that are going on when you talk about mapping the neurons of the brain. I mean, it's this incredibly complex system. Where are we at on that in layman's terms, so to speak?
It's incredibly complex. I mean, we're certainly not at the point where we can manipulate the system, because in order to manipulate the system, you really have to have a pretty deep understanding of how, number one, you have to have an understanding of how it works. And number two, you have to have the right kind of inputs. I mean, just injecting current into the brain is a very, very crude form of input. So you have all these networks of neurons that are firing action potentials. The action potentials is one part of the process. And if you inject current, you might be able to change, say, the frequency of action potentials. But you have these network effects and the strength of connections between the various neurons, the way the individual synapses function. And those things are very hard to manipulate. I mean, I don't know how you manipulate the strength of a particular neural circuit in the way that you want to at this point with our current technologies. So I do think, like, looking into the very, very far future, maybe it's possible to do that kind of stuff. But simply by putting a few electrodes in there, you're only going to be able to do some of the simple things like manipulating little muscle twitches or movements, or, you know, possibly if you do it in the visual cortex, you might get something like visual phosphenes, which are little, you know, glitters of light. But to, you know, contrast that with creating a full-fledged percept where you see, I don't know, an elephant riding through the sunset, you're going to have a much, you know, orders of magnitude more control over the dynamics of the system.
Yeah, big time. Plus, how do you simulate, how do you show somebody something they've never seen before or experienced before? It's not there in the brain to be remembered as a memory, so you're going to have to composite it. So that means you're really going to have to understand how this system works, because composites of imagery I imagine are not just a matter of reading off, you know, what the eye is showing in the back of the brain, but it's a matter of bringing this thing called, that we barely understand, called imagination, into it.
Mm-hmm.
I keep trying to nail you down to numbers and stuff, and you're very good at sort of, well, I don't really know about that quite yet. No, it's good, and it's good. It's good. I'm not even like being critical, but like imagination. Do we have any neurological understanding yet of how that works?
We do, and actually, in my lab, we've done some studies on brain reading of imagination.
Yeah.
So we've been able to look at what happens when somebody. We did some studies on imagining sounds, for example. We asked people to imagine different kinds of sounds, and what we were able to do is, from the patterns of brain activity in the auditory cortex of the brain, this is the part of the temporal lobe that receives information from the ears, ultimately, not directly from the ears, but eventually. From the patterns of activity in auditory cortex during imagination, we were able to determine what sound people were imagining. And so what we believe is happening is that the brain recreates the initial experiences through these kind of top-down processes, so that lower sensory cortices end up kind of reinstantiating the experiences that we have when we're really experiencing something. So we know about it to that extent, that imagination seems to be a kind of a replay of real experiences in the sensory cortices of the brain. Similar things have been done with visual imagination.
Well, that's interesting. Am I understanding this right? That would limit one's imagination to experience?
Or to the units of an experience. Like you said, you can always composite things. So yeah, I think there's, you know, you can't imagine something that you have no basis for imagination, but I can certainly imagine, I don't know, you with a elephant head. I don't know why I'm stuck on elephants today. That's a composite that I've never seen before.
Right. Okay, well, that's actually in and of itself a fascinating piece of information, because that tells us that, you know, because we so categorize, we so take in information, and then, okay, this fits here, this fits here, this fits here, and then imagination is sort of, you know, imaginatively reimagining these things in composites we have not experienced. But wow, that is you know, I don't know, maybe infinity is not the limit of our imagination, as that is that way. Where do you think, it seems to me, actually, I don't know, did you get Elon Musk's presentation as a recruitment seminar?
He explicitly labeled it as a recruitment
seminar. Did. Okay, good. I didn't see that part, so.
Failed to recruit me.
Yeah. Oh, I wondered, because I did go to the Neuralink site and I looked on the jobs, and they're all engineering mainly. And I noticed that I was a little surprised, and maybe I can't say that I know what his crew or his staff list looks like, but I'm more than a little concerned about the cognitive psychology end of this. It's not, people who have commented on this or talked about this, because we've seen articles in Forbes and MIT and various other technological review sites and things talking about Musk's presentation and saying, hey, look, he's talking a really big talk, but let's talk reality. We're nowhere near the kind of promises he's making when it comes to being able to have the lame walk or the blind see, much less, computer-assisted telepathy. These are these are almost sci-fi concepts still, but here's Musk pumping this out there. Do you think he might need some more cognitive psychiatrists or neuroscientists on board before he starts making those promises?
Maybe. I mean, yeah, they do have neuroscientists on the team, and there was at least one neuroscientist who spoke there and seemed to know what they were doing. So, I do think that they are really focused on making a usable product, and it seems like a lot of what they want is people that I think they feel comfortable with the neuroscience, and what they want to do is push it towards some marketable product that people can have. And I think you're right that the worry there is that the push towards marketing happens faster than the understanding of the neuroscience does. Now, how close are they to something like telekinesis or getting people to walk? I don't know. I got the impression from watching it that the medical miracles that they were sort of promising are a bit of a cover story. I mean, I feel like their real motivation is they think it would be cool if this worked, and they want to see it happen because it would be very sci-fi, which is totally a legitimate motivation, and I have it myself. But then, framing it in terms of the medical uses is a more palatable way to deliver the product to the public is sort of how it seems to me. I mean, one of the easiest things that you could probably come up with as a product from this that would be relatively easy to do is something like telekinesis, right? If you have this thing connected to your motor cortex and you connect it to your remote control, it should be fairly easy to change the channel without picking up the remote control. You just send a motor signal from your motor cortex, flip the channel up or down, something like that. We can probably already do that with less invasive brain-computer interfaces, whether they be from EEG or whatever. But so there are certain things that you could turn into a product that wouldn't be that far off.
Wow. So, okay, that's actually good to know, because that starts giving me some boundaries now of where we're actually at. And I want to understand that, because I don't want to make it seem like this is all just some bizarre fantasy, and maybe I'm coming off that way, and I don't mean to. I'm concerned. I'm concerned about this going at a pace that outpaces our thinking about the ethical ramifications of it. That's where I always come down on this stuff. And I have good reason to, because the history of science sometimes goes in bad directions,
Whatever happened?
Yeah. I know. I don't know what I'm talking about. I know it's true. So I'm a little concerned about that. Now, I'm also, of course, concerned about, what we already have with AI and that sort of thing. When it comes to how do you see, from your experience, knowledge, and formal, what you're doing, with your job, how do you keep up with or keep tabs at all on where we're at with AI versus humans?
Yeah, a little bit. And there's, AI, the confidence in artificial intelligence has waxed and wanes over the years that I've been involved in cognitive science. There's a real surge of interest in artificial intelligence back in the 70s and 80s. And I think that wave kind of subsided as people got a little bit jaded that things weren't progressing as fast as they were. And we came up against certain walls in artificial intelligence. And it became much more popular to think that AI was really never going to rise. And then with increases in computing power and the progress in machine learning and deep learning techniques, there's been a new surge in in hope or optimism about the potentials of artificial intelligence to reach or surpass human levels. And I don't know if that's going to happen or if we're going to hit another one of these walls and things will come back down for another ride. But again, it's more of one of these like short-term horizon versus long-term horizon things. I think in the very long-term horizon, there's just very little reason to think we won't ultimately have artificial intelligences that exceed human intelligence capacity in terms
Right.
of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, in some ways, from certain points of view, we've already passed that point. We have computers that are doing things, programming themselves, rewriting their own code, in other words. We have algorithms that are beyond the control of the people who wrote them, so to speak. They're doing things they don't necessarily fully understand. This all comes out of social media, Social Dilemma documentary, and other work when you look into some of this stuff. And I think that was actually my sort of object lesson or case study in why I'm concerned about the Neuralink and the efforts being made in that direction, is because already with the keyboard interfaces and the social media networks that we've established, these platforms are working again. They are leveraging our psychology against us because they were built in such a way that they didn't really understand how our psychology works. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I mean, really, they were also built in order to get people rich, right? And the interest of building wealth for the inventors does not always align with the well-being of the customers.
Exactly. Exactly. And unfortunately, all of us have been part of this, sort of mass hypnosis, mass psychology experiment that's been going on for the last 20 years. And now we're seeing the results in a divided culture across the world and a lot of negative ramifications of this. It's not that the technology itself is inherently bad, but these algorithms are leveraging things about the way we think that we didn't really understand about ourselves. And that's what I find most fascinating and frankly a little disturbing, is the eagerness with which to move forward before we really understand where we're even at. And that's why I love talking to you, because I want to understand where we're at. And like, for example, I think it's a fairly high level of understanding of our psychology at this point that we are not, to understand that we are not truth machines. Our brains are not designed, if I understand this right, and I am asking, with our cerebral cortex and the way we process information, it's not done with a purpose to find truth. It's designed to make us make sense of the world. And those are two different things. True, does that little bit make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, well, the basic thing we're designed to do is to stay alive,
Right.
and staying alive is a cooperative venture at this point, and staying alive requires that we have strong relationships with others, and so maintaining those relationships that keep us alive and give us the kind of social bonds that we need can be prioritized and can be more important in our system than making sure what we believe is true. So I think in that sense, you're right. We're not optimized necessarily to find the truth. We certainly benefit from having models of the world that allow us to make accurate predictions. And if our models of the world are really far off in a way that gets us in danger, ultimately that's not good for us. So it's not, I don't want to give the impression that we have no interest in being correct about things. We do, right? If we think this particular plant is not poisonous and it is, that's, we're screwed. But there are other interests at play, and social bonding is one of the important ones that can throw us off.
Big time. And it's this bit of a struggle between these things because we are incredibly socially evolved creatures, comparatively. There's all kinds of levels and strata to every one of our individual human relations that are quite complicated. I wonder though, we also make assumptions about humans being more or more of anything compared to, say, animals. Yet a lot of the testing that has led to us understanding ourselves comes from testing fish, pigs, animals, right? Guinea pigs, monkeys. I mean, are we really that much more advanced than these lower quote unquote life forms?
we share so much of our biology and so much of our nervous systems with, our close relatives, the primates, and as you say, even with fish, a lot of the biochemistry is the same. So yes, I'd say there's so much of us is similar, and the parts that are different are in some ways a drop in the bucket. I mean, we share 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees. On the other hand, little differences can make a big difference. One of the differences between humans and other primates is language, and conceptual language makes such a big difference and allows us to build culture and civilization. And certainly in that sense, we've done a lot more with that little bit of extra. To tie that with artificial intelligence makes you wonder what an artificial intelligence with just a little bit more than us is going to be capable of doing, right?
Big time. I mean, and this is where Musk comes from, and he's not wrong. I mean, if we could, if we could incorporate with, a higher level of data access, of memory processing, of computational power, then maybe the sky really is the limit for us in some ways. Maybe we could figure out problems that thus far have eluded our ability to think them through, like the complex math necessary to even understand the system. One wonders, can we make the system without that? Can we get there and then back figure it out? That seems to be how our progress moves forward, is we seem to accidentally stumble on some amazing piece of thing that we needed to know, and then we back figure out why that works.
It's true. I mean, in this whole conversation, I want to be clear that I want this thing in my brain. I at least want to try it out. I feel like we are in a strange point in the evolution of our relationship with technology where we have a lot of benefits from it. Like the amount of information that's available on just Wikipedia, for example, is amazing. But the fact that I have to disconnect my attention from the world and look down to this little device that I have in front of me in order to access it is a huge problem. I mean, it creates social disconnect. Eye contact is messed up with everybody. If I could just access that information on the fly using my mind, I could look something up from Wikipedia while we're having this conversation so that I could incorporate it into what we're talking about. I want to be able to do that.
I got to tell you, I see the benefits, and I'm always going to be the guy who's going to raise the alarm because I've had the experiences I've had where I dived in when I didn't know everything that I should have known, and then, faced decades of repercussions as a result. So, of course, I'm going to do that. But I am also excited about the possibilities or potentials of it, too. Oh, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
Well, what if you had, speaking of potentials like that, what if you could build in through policy or law, something like, how on Twitter now they have those little warning signals when the tweet may be disingenuous or something.
This tweet might be hazardous to your mental health.
Right. If you encounter something that somebody says that might be hazardous to your mental health or might be trying to suck you into something, if you got a little warning from your implanted AI, that could help. And there's a lot of ways to imagine these things being beneficial if the right systems were in place.
Actually, that's very true. That's very true. In fact, let me share something with you that you might find amusing, and it builds on our memory episode, like what we did last time. A very funny old skit from the 80s that we were watching, I think it was just last night on Saturday Night Live. Paul Simon was in this little skit where people were coming up to him. The idea was he was standing in line in a movie theater with a date, and people kept coming up to him, fans, telling him, "Oh yeah, I saw you here, I saw you there," and the joke was that he remembered in detail every single one of them. Right?
Yeah.
Where, I stood in the crowd in 1975 at the concert in the park, in Central Park, and he goes, "Oh yeah, you were the one with the red blanket, and you said more. Yeah, I was glad you were there." He remembered like these hyper specific details, but it did not interrupt the flow of the conversation in any way. And it made me think of that when you were just talking about, if you could do that without having to go, "Oh, hang on a second, who are you again? What? Got to look that up in my phone. Got to look that up somewhere." If you just could know that stuff.
Garfunkel comes up and he has no idea who he is. Right?
He did. That was the final joke at the end of the skit. That's right. So so there is an idea of a memory feat that, of course, a handful of humans would actually be able to pull off right now, could itself be a curse if it was an organic problem that you were, as we talked about, that you were like stuck with having to remember every single little detail of every single day. That would be a curse. But to have the ability to draw the information up at will,
Right.
and be able to do it accurately, now that's a whole different, that changes humanity at a fundamental level.
Or to turn it off if you chose not to do that, right? I mean, there's some control. Right. Having control over the information that comes into our minds is going to be an ongoing problem. And we certainly see it on social media now, and it can be an even bigger problem if there's a chip implanted in our brains that allows information to flow in. We'd have to worry about things like, is an advertisement going to pop up in my visual field because it's being piped in by somebody who's controlling the information feed.
That's
Google.
Right. Is Mr. Pillow going to try to sell you something this week? And there it goes across your visual cortex, right?
Usually you're lying down on your pillow and then it comes up, but wouldn't it be better if it...
Yeah, I don't think we want any of that. And in fact, that's the whole problem with the way social media platforms have been programmed, is that they were programmed on an advertiser-based attention economy. And that has turned out to be absolutely catastrophic to our mental health and our social well-being, really, as a direct result of that. So hopefully we will be seeing a lot more work in that direction to get that sort of Pandora's box closed or altered or something.
Yeah, or something. I mean, we can learn from that experience and put in place policies going forward so that these new technologies are not subject to that same problem that we've learned is not good for us. That would be a really important thing for us to do.
Exactly. As long as we can learn from our mistakes, I have hope for us as a species, I mean, and it seems that some problems we take a bit longer to get around to recognizing the problems with than others. It's difficult, isn't it?
Difficult, yes.
Well, where are okay, so let me think about this here, because I want to get back on the Neuralink thing. If you could right now describe the best thing we could do in terms of, like the highest form of where we're at in a human technology hybrid, what comes to your mind? Where are we at in terms of the real penultimate of practical technology right now?
In terms of what we could do with this technology, you mean?
Yeah.
And I think paralysis is probably one of the things that's really within our grasp to be able to solve. And this is just an issue of communication between different parts of the nervous system that can be severed. And if you can bypass that communication through some kind of wireless technology that goes directly from the brain to the muscles in the limbs, that seems like something that's really worth doing that we could absolutely accomplish.
Wow. That would be amazing. I wasn't sure how far along we were with that. They talk about how when you are training people who are paralyzed, I was watching a couple videos here this morning about some of this, and there were people who are laying in bed, completely unable to move, who can control a dot on the screen, right, in a direction to, starting this program forward of controlling literally with the brain alone what's going on a screen. Are we further than the dot moving?
Well, we've done it in monkeys. They've been able to connect a monkey brain to a robotic arm, and then the monkey can learn to manipulate and control the arm and pick things up. And the freaky thing is that because the signals are coming from the monkey's brain and being sent to the robotic arm, the arm doesn't need to be in the same place as the monkey. There was one demonstration of this where the arm was, connected in another lab halfway across the country, and then the signals were sent over the internet, and the monkey could control the arm on the East Coast from the West Coast, for example.
That opens up so many possibilities with robotics as well.
Yeah.
Wow, I hadn't even thought about that.
Think of sort of controlling a big construction machine arms with your brain, in the way those kind of like the exoskeletons in the Avatar movie, but from a distance.
Right, because that opens the door to a deep ocean exploration. I mean, as far as you can get a signal down. If
Yeah.
you get a signal down there, and but we're talking about controlling with the brain directly. I mean, that's pretty wild. So, because then it's a whole different training paradigm. You don't have to sit there and train the person on all this complex machinery. They just hook them up and then they just know what, wow.
It may take some learning how to control the implant. It isn't necessarily the case. I don't think this has been done enough in humans to know. But I'm pretty sure that in the monkey research, which again is not something I follow that closely, but I believe there's a learning period where the monkey has, through feedback, has to learn the different signals that I send through my brain. What does it actually cause the arm to do exactly? And you can kind of adjust over some period of time. So there may be a learning curve there, and learning how to
Yeah. There was, and they certainly mentioned that with the paralyzed patients as well. That in fact they were saying this is one of the, in comparing this to the promises of Neuralink, they were saying, whoa, hey guys, yeah, but there's a learning curve here too. And I don't know that probably the best way to describe it is the same way you have to learn how to write or you have to learn how to pick up a can. I mean, these are childlike things that we just take for granted, but there was a period in time where you didn't know how to do these things and you had to train your brain and body to learn how to do them. And I think it's kind of a parallel to that, right?
It is. And the motor cortexes and sensory cortexes are pretty plastic and you can adjust to things like this. And so I imagine the brain would be pretty adaptable to being able to control some new external limb or something like that.
Right.
I will say the other thing is that as a neuroscientist, one of the things that's exciting about this is just the opportunity to collect all of this data. I mean, we're talking about things we don't know about. It's difficult to get recordings directly from the human brain. We typically, most neuroscientists don't have access to the physical brain because, for the purposes of learning about, say, we're going to do our study on belief, it's not really ethical to open up somebody's head for that purpose, right? So we use
do it. Sacrifices must be made.
Well, we use that's why we use neuroimaging techniques because they're less invasive, but they're also much more indirect. And the information that we get from functional MRI is many events downstream from the actual neural activity, from the actual action potential. So the opportunity to record directly from the brain is very rare. But sometimes we have it in case of when there are going to be surgeries. We can work. I worked once with a neurosurgeon at UCLA who was doing neurosurgery implants to record seizure activity. And we would use those opportunities to record from the person doing various psychological tasks, and we could learn something about them. But those opportunities are very rare, and you don't always get to pick where the electrodes are going to be. So with something like this, with the Neuralink, where if it really is as uninvasive as they claim, where you can go in on, just for a few hours without general anesthesia and have this robotic surgeon carve a little piece out of your skull and drop this thing in, which plugs the hole and glue it back up. And then if you're someone like you, the hair would grow over it. Someone like me, I'd be able to scar. If it is that non-invasive, then we're going to have, we have thousands of people doing this. We're going to be generating tons of data from the brain that we didn't have otherwise. These actual direct recordings from the surface of the cortex. And that's incredibly valuable information.
That's a good point. And we need it too, because as you say, it's difficult and rare. Am I understanding this right though? I want to say this for the audience as well. So this cortex, this couple millimeter layer of surface of our brain, that's something that we have that no one else has to the same degree. Is that right? It's a numbers game, and we have more of that than anything else on the planet?
Well, cerebral cortex is not unique to humans. Cerebral cortex exists in many other animals. What you see as you move through the animal kingdom, if you compare something like a rat to a dog to a chimpanzee to a human, is more and more folding of the cortex. And so we have a lot more folded cortex. You see a lot more of those lumps and grooves when you look at the human brain. And that's because we're increasing the amount of surface area. The cerebral cortex is essentially a two-dimensional structure. You can think of it like a piece of paper that's crumpled up to fit inside the brain. And if you have a bigger piece of paper, the more you have to crumple it up more to fit in the same space. That's sort of nature's solution to getting us more surface area in the cerebral cortex. Instead of growing huge heads, we grow more convoluted cortices.
Right. And how does that compare? So it's not necessarily so okay, so surface area. Um, but it doesn't seem to hold that size of the brain leads to more complex thinking or rational thought as we understand it or something. Because we look at whales, say, or larger creatures, and they don't seem to have language or anything developed the way we do.
Right. If you do something like size of the brain relative to the size of the body, then you get what looks more like a correlation with intelligence, but it's still
Oh.
not correlations. You're right. Like elephants have huge brains. It's just, gosh, I don't know why I'm not intending to talk about elephants all the time today. It's like a third time.
it's it's an after effect from our last show about elephants and memory and all that. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, just having a big brain does not necessarily mean anything. But having more brain relative to your body size might mean a little bit more.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, I was always kind of wondering about that correlation. I never had a chance to ask you about it. Okay, so for whatever reason, we've got this thing that we get to use this way where we get to think very, very highly complicated thoughts and establish very complicated social hierarchies that other creatures, have shades of, but not the same level of complexity that we have. For whatever reason, we're still trying to break down why that is. So this isn't then something that you think we should be afraid of.
I think we should be cautious. I don't know if fear is the right word, but yeah, caution is probably good. But no, I don't think we should outright dismiss it out of fear. I don't think it would be rational to do that. I think it's important to think through what the benefits are, and to proceed cautiously.
Yeah, that's been, and I was, it was a real question. I wasn't asking a loaded question there. I wasn't sure where, when I don't know enough about a thing, I try to find out more by people like yourself who can tell me, and then adjust my attitude accordingly, right?
Yeah, I know. But when it comes to something like the future, we're all pretty ignorant. So
Yes.
nobody has. I think part of the reason we need to have caution is because of that nobody really knows exactly what is going to happen with technology like this, and what the consequences of incorporating it into humanity will be.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm trying to think right now, even if we could boost memory like the way we talked about the Paul Simon example, right? If we could do that, like fairly straight away, or if that was an achievable goal. The real question for me is not should we do that or could we do that? The question I ask, and maybe this comes down to me wearing some kind of ethicist hat or something, is what are the unintended consequences of doing that? Yeah, we get all this wonderful, it's very easy to see benefits right away. Oh yeah, we're not looking at the phones, we interact better, it improves sociality. So you go, good. But what are we not thinking right now? And I was wondering, you're in the field, not the neuralink field, but you're in the field of trying to figure out, why we think, how we think, and what's going on there. Do you see people in the field push back like that? Are there ethicists? Are there people who are concerned about the unintended consequences of where some of this is going?
Absolutely. I mean, in preparation I knew we were going to talk about this today. I did an informal survey of my colleagues just this morning, and everybody is first reaction is like, "Whoa, wait a minute! Wait, is that a good thing to do? Should we be doing that? Is that what are the ethical consequences of it? What are the unintended consequences?" I think people in academia, at least, are naturally cautious. And it's interesting in seeing how Neuralink has positioned themselves, and in some of the language that comes out of Elon Musk about this. And he had some comments on Twitter about how academics basically just sit around and question things and never get anything done. And there's definitely some truth to that. His goal is to make things happen. And to do that requires having a sort of vision and pushing things forward beyond what other people think are possible. And so he has to have that orientation. And so there's sort of two poles of, you're trying to figure out where is the balance point there between being too gung-ho about this thing in order to make it happen on the one hand, and being too just sort of like fearful and irrationally worried about it on the other hand. And I personally fall somewhere in the middle where I think it's important to think through what the consequences are. I think we have the time to do that. I don't think that this is going to happen tomorrow, despite what they're trying to sell us on. So I think we should begin that process. This conversation is part of that, of thinking through what the consequences of having a technology like this are. I think our government should be involved in this. This is something we should be thinking about, what the policies are with respect to brain implants and human-machine interfaces, and what's going to be allowed and what isn't going to be allowed. And hopefully we can draw on what we've learned from social media for that. This is something that our society should be preparing for, not necessarily trying to stop, but preparing for.
I agree, because I don't think it can be stopped. I don't think there is such a thing as getting the genie back in the bottle. But I do think that, careful consideration is really important. And we've seen over and over again through history the sort of push forward by exactly the Elon Musk types, the innovators, the dreamers, the visionaries. We want those people. I'm not anti-visionary. I'm all about that. I support many of Elon's visions, actually, especially space travel. I'm huge on that. I see that where many people right now are like, fuck Mars, fuck space exploration. We don't need any of that. We got problems right here on Earth. And it's kind of like, yeah, that's the point. That's exactly the point of why we need to be looking up in space and figuring out how we're going to get out there. And then the exact opposite, inner space. Right? And how do we get in there, and how do we figure that out? But it can be done right. It can be done wrong. And sometimes it can be done mega wrong. And I think the thing that concerns me is the ethical implications of some of this, because if you go about creating a few supermen and they're empowered beyond anything any of us could even imagine, then suddenly all of us are at the mercy of their ethics.
Right. And, even if it's not a few Supermen, this is something that one of my students brought up this morning. Access to this technology, even if it's sort of widely available, depending on how it's sort of equally distributed among the population, is something that can exacerbate inequality across people, right? You're taking the sort of financial equality you're translating it now into cognitive inequality, because you're enhancing the cognitive power of people with more wealth. And so that's something to think about as well.
That's right. Exactly. This is where we take our most basic impulses, ideas, directives, if you will, of why we act the way we do, and if we exacerbate those without understanding them, then we end up with another social dilemma. And if that's out in the real world and not just in a virtual world of a virtual space, if that's in the real world now, there could be, tremendous repercussions and consequences to that. So I agree that I think it is silly to think we're gonna stop it, but I do think that now is the time to really, really, really be thinking about this very, very hard. So I want to thank you for helping me to do that.
Sure.
Was there anything else about this that you wanted to get across that I did not ask you about? Because I know you've been thinking about this quite a bit as well.
Yeah, no, I think we covered the spectrum of it. I think I guess the other thing, one point that I would like to make is that I do think it's important for us to, you talked about going to Mars and how that's something you're really interested in. And, that's something that inspires a lot of people to think about going to space. And there's something valuable about that kind of scientific inspiration, or about the kind of wonder that such a venture inspires in people. And I think the same thing is possible for this kind of connection. There are a lot of us that are really interested in the possibilities of this and what we can do in terms of developing our humanity and going beyond, the physical boundaries of what we have right now. That's inspiring to people. And I do think it's important in the whole conversation that while we also cultivate the caution, that we also cultivate that inspiration that led us to want to do this in the first place, because both are important.
Yeah, exactly. What it actually sparks me to ask you this, because I've never asked you this before. You're doing work that is right on the line of figuring out the brain and figuring out specifically how we think, why we think, what we think. Imagine we figured it out. 1, 2, 3 lifetimes from now. I don't know how long it's going to take, when the breakthrough is going to happen, or breakthroughs that need to happen. How do you see humanity different as a result of understanding this thing at levels we do not understand it at right now?
Yeah, that's an important question. It's one I've been thinking a lot about recently because, at this point, the progress we've made in neuroscience, I don't think it's made that much of an impact on us, or at least it's hard to see what exactly the impacts are. But there are some, and I think, just having a greater self-awareness, understanding ourselves better, allows us to control the process better, to steer towards well-being. There was a TV show in the 80s that I used to like called The Greatest American Hero. You ever see that show?
Yes. Yeah, I love that show.
Given the superpowers, but on the first day, these aliens gave him superpowers, but on the first day, he lost the manual that they had given him. And so he didn't know how to fly. He had this whole power, and he was basically figuring it out throughout the whole season. And, that's what we want eventually, is to recover that manual so that we can unlock all of our powers and we can steer ourselves through the sky more effectively. Excuse me for that.
That's right. Well, and that's exactly right. That's why I'm interested in it. I want to get this thing so that we can help people not be gullible. Not be silly, not let their emotional needs overpower their rational needs or understandings, and there's a balance there, and we seem to be evolving in this direction where we can move towards rationality, where we can develop the cerebral cortex more, where we can figure out how to utilize it to optimize it to be, to lead better lives, safer lives, more productive lives. And I don't know what else we could really ask for from this. Some people have ideas of immortality and stuff. I think that's a little silly, given that immortality is a bit of a curse if you really think about it. But leading better, more productive lives, getting along better, understanding one another better, interacting at a deeper level. These are the kind of things that excite me about a brain machine hybrid and the potentials of it, Yeah,
one of those things you said in there we probably haven't talked about enough, which is the potential for communication between people. And a direct link between our brains could allow us to interact and to communicate in ways that we weren't able to before on a deeper level that transcends language, possibly. So that's one of the real promises of it.
Yeah, big time. If I could sit here and conceptualize something and get that somehow over a wire to you, where you're conceptualizing the same thing, I mean, man, wow. Yeah. What a level of communication that we can really only dream about right now.
Right.
Because we have to use words as this medium, and words are clumsy. Words are chunky sometimes. Sure. When you really dig down. I mean, because my background, I happen to have a bit of an understanding of how people understand words, and they understand them in radically different ways. Mm-hmm. And you can have two people saying the exact same words and meaning very different things. So this could be a real important part of this whole thing, exactly as you comment there. Well, I guess we're going to have to see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Who's going to be first to have this brain implant, me or you?
Oh, I think it'll be you. I think it'll be you because you're working there. but I think who knows? We'll have to see what happens. If you can go down to Best Buy or the Apple Store or something and pick up your implant and just kind of ding 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 and there you go. Wow.
Yeah.
You know. What do you think? Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about this. Just as this is a purely physical aesthetic thing, but you know, the Matrix and these movies tend to put the plug back at the brain stem. And then we see these neuralinks actually going up here and attaching to the cerebral cortex. Is that a big difference? I mean, is there? Do you think we'll ever do the brainstem, or what do you think that with that?
The matrix thing in the back of the neck, I guess it's connected to the brain stem. It's not clear where exactly it would be going in.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Neuralink one makes sense because it's over the motor cortex, and that's right over here. So that's and the sensory cortex, which is what they're going for. I think if you wanted a visual one, would be in the back of the cerebral cortex in the back of your head where the visual cortex is. So it's possible at some phase of this we'll have little dots all over with different implants trying to reach different parts of the cerebral cortex.
Yeah, exactly. Because what I got from the just to sort of have some fun with this, the brainstem connection in the Matrix and similar movies actually has this spike go into your head, quite deep. You know, so it's sort of this built-in thing that actually goes up into the brain is how I imagine they've sort of put this thing together.
You don't want to stick things into the brainstem. Maybe that sounds like a cool thing to say, but the brainstem controls a lot of the vital functions of the body, your heart beating, your respiration, and it's fairly easy to die if something goes into your brainstem. The cortex is more pliable; it's a bit safer. We do implant deep brain stimulators, which go down into the thalamus or the basal ganglia sometimes as treatments for movement disorders like Parkinson's disease. But that's something that you plant with one surgery that never comes out and it stays in there, hopefully. This thing is meant to be removable, which is why it's in the skull.
Right. Makes sense. Totally makes sense. Just something I was always wondering about, and I never had a chance to ask a neuroscientist about.
We do have I don't know the other sort of less invasive way of stimulating the brain that hasn't come up in our conversation, which I have done some work with myself in the past, is transcranial magnetic stimulation. So this is where
I wanted to ask you about this. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, you have a coil and you put it up against the head and you run current through the coil and you turn the current on and off such that it creates a magnetic fluctuation, and you can induce a current in the brain right underneath the coil. And depending on where you point this thing, you can either stimulate and how you deliver the current. You can either stimulate the brain or you can sort of inactivate temporarily one region of the brain. If you do this over the motor cortex, just like with those little neurosurgery experiments we talked about earlier, you can get little finger twitches depending on where you aim it. So that's a way of doing it through the scalp, but it's obviously much less precise than having those little wires directly into the brain.
Yeah, exactly. I was reading just last week about that and how it has had positive results. What I was reading was that it was fairly uniform positive results in treating depression and anxiety, and I was very surprised by that because I've barely heard of it as a treatment modality or as a technology.
Yes, and we did an early experiment back when I was at UCLA on generalized anxiety disorder, and we would deliver stimulation once a week to people with the disorder, and then they did actually improve over time. So it's a way of that particular type of stimulation is a way of disrupting the circuits in the brain that are probably engaged in kind of counterproductive loop that you're sort of interrupting. It's akin to the old electroconvulsive shock therapy that you would do with depression.
Well, I wanted to ask about that because ECT has always terrified me, but also from a precision point of view, also seems to be a bit of a, I've got a sore finger. Okay, good. Let me take you and shove your body up against a wall and maybe I'll fix your sore finger. I mean, I really have had very big problems with ECT as a form of treatment because it's such a Hail Mary
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets a bad rap because of all the movie appearances it's made
Well,
where
What Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was pretty like, whoa, yeah,
the fact is it's pretty effective. And you're right. The TMS is a little bit less of a kludge. It's still kind of a kludge. In the study that we did, we would actually use fMRI to localize a particular spot in the person's brain before then using that active brain activation to precisely localize the TMS stimulation to a spot in that person's brain was activated when they were anxious. So it's a much more precise way of doing it, but it's a similar principle.
yeah, yeah, similar. I guess I prefer the precision of it, only because, well, I mean, with ECT, you get memory loss, you get these other effects, it's a little scary, but I am happy to see, the progress that's being made here because we're all trying to get to the same place. I mean, I think we're all trying to get to a place where we're helping people and where we're able to be more effective in doing so, So, uh, I don't know. It's funny that if you get into the history of psychiatry and stuff, you start getting into like the lobotomies and as some of the stuff that we now look at as barbaric was at the time cutting edge.
Yes, I think that in some ways, psychiatry has earned the reputation that the Scientologists have given it. Right, but a lot of those treatments, the brutality of them or the apparent brutality of them is hard to understand in retrospect. But you also have to keep in mind that we didn't have a lot of the pharmaceutical interventions back then that we do now. If you have a patient that's experiencing epilepsy, for example, and they're having seizures just all day long. And nowadays, we would have all kinds of anticonvulsant medications that we would give them. But back in the 50s, there were various, this neurosurgeons were trying everything they could possibly think of to make the seizure stop. And that often involved cutting pieces of the brain in ways that now seem kind of barbaric if you're not faced with the same problem. So,
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure. I have to always, put out there hindsight bias is a thing, and I don't want to engage in it. So it's difficult. It becomes a more nuanced conversation for sure, because again, these were not necessarily people who were operating out of malintent.
well, some of them may have been. I mean,
Oh, so just a couple for sure. But yeah.
there's a couple of well-known cases of people who certainly seem pretty crazy with the lobotomies.
Yes. Yeah. The guy driving around giving them to people in his mobile home, that was a bit much.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a bit much. But yes, I get your point on that. Anyway, I don't want to end on a big downer. It kind of went there. And so I sort of.
Well, that's part of the history of this kind of interacting with the brain and trying to physically interact with it. And, we've been talking as if these implants are voluntary, but it's worth considering the fact that it's important that obviously that they always are put in voluntarily and that we don't implant them in people against their will. But sometimes voluntary can be a gray area. I mean, we may have incentives to implant these things in our brains that make them difficult to resist. Like right now, if you think about participation in social networks, it's very easy to say that you're not going to let your kid participate in a social network, for example, or not going to give them a phone. But then when they're in 7th grade and this is the way that all the kids interact with each other and there's no way to have a social life without it, then the pressure is very difficult to resist.
That's
and
right.
it's being a similar situation with these brain implants, that if everybody has them and there's something that we can't participate in without having this thing put in our head, the line between voluntary and involuntary gets grayer.
Big time. Big time. Very good point. And again, something I think we need to be monitoring and paying more attention to. Because clearly our basic impulse is you want to keep up with the Joneses. It's just, you don't even have to, it's those things that I say, I always try to throw it under the umbrella of these are the things you don't have to think about. They just happen. It's just how you are. And social hierarchies, the existence of them.
Yeah.
Just going to happen. So one-upmanship in the social hierarchy, it's just going to happen. So how do we control for that and try to implement this technology in such a way that it's more maximally beneficial, minimally difficult or harmful? You know, that's always the big key question with this stuff. And it will continue to be our struggle as we move forward, I am sure. But, you know, sparks more conversations like this one. So it's always a good thing. Jonas, thank you for taking the time to be part of my little world and podcast today. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Always a lot of fun.
Awesome, man. And probably next time we'll dive into another aspect of brain work that isn't quite so hypothetical.
Hypothetical can be fun.
It can. It is. It's fun to talk about, and you know, like I said, there's a lot of pros, there's a lot of cons here. There's a lot of food for thought. So I hope you guys will think about it out there, and let me know in the comments what's your feedback, what your thoughts are, where you think this is going. I'm genuinely interested in everybody's take on this one. I don't think this is a thing of, you know, somebody's going to comment how awful we are for talking about this. This isn't a matter of that kind of opinion. I want to know what people think as far as where this tech is going and the ethical and technological ramifications and consequences of it. So let us know. All right, guys. See you next time. We'll just wrap up. Bye-bye.